of a security incident, you may also need to communicate with outside parties regarding the incident. Now, examples include, but of course they're not limited to, contacting law enforcement, fielding media inquiries, right? So if for some reason the press was actually involved, seeking external expertise, working with internet service providers or ISPs, the vendor of your hardware or software products, right, that perhaps are under attack or have a vulnerability, or perhaps even a zero-day vulnerability. Also, how to gather threat intelligence and perhaps, subscribe to threat intelligence feeds. Also, how to communicate with coordination centers and members of other incident response teams, right? Now, you can also share relevant incident indicators of compromise and other information or other observables with your industry peers, right? So a good example of an information sharing community is the Financial Services Information Sharing and Analysis Center, or the FSISAC, right? They actually have a very good platform and community that they actually share a lot of information between financial institutions, right? Perhaps specific indicators of compromise or observables are specific to that vertical, right? That are specific to banks or any type of financial services company. Now, your incident response plan should account for this type of interactions with outside entities. It should also include information about how to interact with your organization's public relations team or your PR department, and your legal department, of course, and of upper management as well, right? So you should also get their buy-in, right, whenever you're sharing and interacting with outside parties to actually minimize the risk of information leakage. Now, to avoid for sensitive information regarding security incidents to be shared with unauthorized parties and potentially leading to additional disruption and financial loss, right? That's why it's important that you actually have a good process and a good plan for doing that, right? You should also maintain a list of all the contacts at those external entities and external communications for liability and also for evidence, so in the case of you're actually collecting evidence and evidentiary purposes as well. In this course, you will learn all the details about incident response teams, but here are a few different incident response teams categories or, examples, right? The most popular is the corporate or the internal computer incident response team, and in many cases, they're referred to as a CSIRT team. However, there's several others like the PSIRT or a product security incident response team, a national CSIRT, and computer emergency response teams or CERTs. There are also coordination centers. There are also the incident response teams of security vendors and managed security service providers, right? Now, here are the most common incident response team structures, right? You can actually have an incident response team centralized within the organization. However, the incident response team may also be distributed, right, among, different organizations within or business units within the organization, right? There's also a coordinating team, right? You may actually have a coordinating team within your organization. Now, these are some of the most common incident response team staffing models, right? You can either have full-time employees, completely full-time employees and no outsourced team or outsourcers or, contractors, or you can actually have a partially outsourced incident response team, right? So where some are full-time employees of your organization and some of them are outsourced. Or you can fully outsource your incident response team. There are different incident response teams, and in the previous lesson you learned that the most popular is the corporate or the internal computer incident response team, or otherwise known as a CSIRT. However, there are others that you also learn from a high level, the PSIRT team or the product security incident response teams, national CSIRTs and computer emergency response team or CERTs, coordination centers, incident response team from other vendors or security vendors and managed service providers, right? But now let's learn all about CSIRTs, right? The internal corporate computer security incident response team, right? A CSIRT is typically the team that is actually in charge to work hand in hand with the information security team, so otherwise called InfoSec, right? With smaller organizations, basically the InfoSec and the CSIRT may actually be exactly the same team. In large organizations, on the other hand, the CSIRT is a specialized team that carries out the investigation of computer security incidents, and the InfoSec team is actually tasked with the implementation of security configurations, also with monitoring and policies within the organization. Now, the steps to establish a CSIRT is a process that includes, things like defining the constituency of that CSIRT, right? Making sure that management and executive teams are supporting you, right? Making sure that the proper budget is also allocated, right? Deciding where the CSIRT will actually reside within the organization, and where within the organization, right? Determining whether the team will be central, distributed, or virtual team, right? Also developing the process and policies for the CSIRT itself, right? It is very important to recognize that the steps, that I just mentioned can be accomplished in parallel and not in sequence, right? So this will all depend within your organization and, of course, within your environment, right? Now, defining the constituency of a CSIRT or any of the previously mentioned incident response teams is certainly one of the first steps in the process, right? So whenever you actually do that, you should answer, questions like, who will be the customer of the CSIRT, or what is actually the scope, right? So will the CSIRT cover only the organization or also entities external to the organization, right? A good example of this is that Cisco, all internal infrastructure and Cisco's websites and tools, right, like Cisco.com, they're all a responsibility of the Cisco CSIRT. And any incident or vulnerability that affects a product or a service, that is used by a customer, it is a responsibility of the Cisco PSIRT team, so the Product Security Incident Response team, right? You will also have to answer the questions, will the CSIRT provide support for the complete organization or for only a specific area or a segment of the organization, right? Will that be only part of the host organization or all of it, right? So all those are questions that you actually should answer, right, whenever you're actually forming the CSIRT team. Now, one of the main goals of the CSIRT is actually to minimize risk, contain cyber damage, and of course to save money by preventing incidents from happening, right? Now, of course, no organization is immune to security incidents, so if they occur, mitigating them effectively is another responsibility of the CSIRT team, right? And again, it all depends on your environment. In some cases, actually, the InfoSec team is actually tasked to do that as well. Now, if you have less damage, of course, the less money you need to spend to recover from a compromise. And that actually includes not only technical damage and, information, but also brand reputation, right? Now, there are many studies in the past that have covered the cause of a security incident, the cause of, and the cause of breaches, right? A good resource is the Eponymon Institute, which they actually periodically publish reports covering, those type of costs, right? Now, it is a good practice to keep informed and calculate what will be the value, and the value add to invest more, not only in a CSIRT, but also in operational best practices, and in some cases even outsourcing some of the cybersecurity functions to a managed service provider, right? And that's actually typically seen in many cases, right? Whenever the organization can actually either not afford or retain security talent within the organization, right? And you may know that actually one of the purpose for you studying of, for the exam and for the CCNA CyberOps certification is because there's a shortage of cybersecurity experts in the market, right? So many organizations actually cannot retain security talent. So what they do is actually seek outside of the organization and seek to outsource some of the cybersecurity functions to a managed service provider. Now, any incident response team must have several basic policies and procedures in place to operate, successfully. And that includes, incident classification and handling, information classification and protection, information dissemination, record retention and destruction. So, how to not only retain and collect evidence and specific records, but also how to dispose them as well, right? How to use encryption, right? Engaging and cooperating with external groups, right? Now, there are some additional policies and procedures that actually can be defined as well, right? And here I'm actually showing a few examples, right? Like a hiring policy, using outsourcing organizations to handle incidents, as I mentioned before, working across multiple legal jurisdictions, and specifically depending on your country, this may be extremely tricky and also extremely important, right? Even more policies can be defined depending on the team's circumstances, right? Now, the important thing is to remember is that not all policies need to be defined on the first day, right? So that's something to keep in mind, right? So this is actually an evolution and is, in some cases, it's a very tricky process, right? Now, these are some great resources of information from the ISO, so the International Organization for Standardization, and also the IEC, International Electrotechnical Commission, right? And all these sources of information, you can leverage them whenever you're, creating your policy and procedure documents within the organization. And I have them here as your reference, right? So they start from the ISO 27001, 02, 05, and 22399 standards, right? That they actually go over information security management system, the code of practice for information security management, information, security risk management, a lot of guidelines for incident, preparation, and also operational continuity management as well, and different security techniques, around the information security incident management itself, right? Now, CERT provides a good overview of the goals and responsibilities of a CSIRT. And I'm actually sharing a link to a document, and then also, it's an FAQ that they actually have that is a really good reference that you should become familiar with whenever you're creating your CSIRT team. Others may actually have separate teams that handle the investigation, resolution, and also the disclosure of security vulnerabilities. And typically, these teams are called the Product Security Incident Response Team, or otherwise known as a PSIRT. As a matter of fact, I'm actually part of a PSIRT team, the Cisco Product Security Incident Response Team. Now, before you understand how a PSIRT operates, you must understand what actually is a security vulnerability, right? So this, of course, might be a refresher from the Security Fundamentals exam, and whenever we're preparing for that exam. But just as a refresher, the National Institutes of Standards and Technology, or NIST, defines a security vulnerability as a flaw or a weakness in system security procedures, design, implementation, or other internal controls that could be exercised. That means accidentally trigger or intentionally exploited and result in a security breach or a violation of the system security policy, right? Now, there are tons of other definitions out there, but they tend to be variations of the one that NIST actually provides and the one that actually I quote here. Now, you may ask yourself, why should you worry about security vulnerabilities in products, right? And this is because each of them represents a potential risk and vector how threat actors can actually compromise your systems and your network, right? Each vulnerability carries a certain amount of risk, within, that vulnerability, right? So one of the most widely adopted standards to actually calculate the severity of a given vulnerability, and that is also used by many PSIRT teams, is the Common Vulnerability Scoring System, or CVSS, right? And CVSS has three major metrics or components: the base, temporal, and environmental scores, right? Each component is actually represented as a score on the scale from 0 to 10. Again, you learn all about CVSS in the preparation to the SecFun exam, but here's actually a very brief refresher, right? So CVSS is an industry standard that is actually maintained by FIRST, right? And it's actually used by many PSIRT teams to convey information about the severity of vulnerabilities that they actually disclose to their customers. In CVSS, a vulnerability is evaluated under three aspects, and scores are assigned to each of those different categories, right? So the base groups represent the characteristics of a vulnerability that are constant over time and do not depend on a user-specific environment, right? So the temporal group assesses the vulnerability as it actually changes over time, and the environmental, just like the word says, actually provides and represents the characteristics of a vulnerability taking into account the organization's environment, right? Now, again, the score for the base group is between 0 and 10, where 0 is the least severity and 10 is assigned to the highly critical vulnerabilities, right? For instance, for vulnerabilities that can allow an attacker to compromise the system and get full control of the system and perhaps do a remote code execution, you will see a higher score whenever you compare it to vulnerabilities that perhaps are a lot more less risky and also harder to actually exploit, right? Now, the formula used to obtain the scores takes into account various characteristics of the vulnerability and how the attacker is actually able to leverage those characteristics, right? So again, I'm actually sharing here a first website that includes the standard specification. They also include a calculator that you can actually take advantage of and many other resources for you to become familiar with CVSS. At the time of recording, the latest version of CVSS was version 3, and that's actually what Cisco and many other organizations actually now use to determine the risk of a given vulnerability, right? Now, there's several other things that are actually taken into consideration, right? And one thing is actually the chaining role and of a vulnerability and fixing prioritization based on that chain, right? Now, in many instances, security vulnerabilities are actually not exploited in isolation. Threat actors actually exploit more than one vulnerability in a chain, and they do that to carry out their attacks and compromise their victims. Now, by leveraging different vulnerabilities in a chain, attackers can actually infiltrate progressively to further, compromise the system and the network, then gaining more control over it, right? This is something that PSIRT teams are actually aware of and must be aware of, and developers, security professionals, and users must also be aware, of these chaining, capabilities, because they can actually change the order in which the vulnerability needs to be fixed or patched, in the actually affected systems, right? So, for example, multiple low severity vulnerabilities can actually become severe if they're actually combined to perform a specific action, right? So, performing vulnerability chaining is not a trivial task, right? Any type of vulnerability can actually be chained. So several commercial companies claim that they can actually easily do it, but the way that you can chain vulnerabilities is actually pretty much endless, right? Now, a PSIRT can learn about vulnerabilities in a product or service, during internal testing or at the development phase, right? This, of course, is the preference of any vendor to be able to actually find the vulnerabilities before somebody else finds it. However, vulnerabilities can also be reported by external entities like security researchers, customers, and other vendors, right? Now, the dream of every vendor is actually to be able to find and patch all security vulnerabilities during the design and development phases. However, of course, that's actually close to impossible, right? Now, this is why a secure development lifecycle, or an SDL, is extremely important for any organization that actually produces software and hardware. Cisco has their own SDL program, and it's actually documented at the link that I'm actually sharing in here, right? So Cisco defined the SDL as a repeatable and a measurable process that actually they have designed to increase the resiliency and also the trustworthiness of their products, right? Cisco's SDL is actually part of the product development methodology, or what they call PDM, and it's also compliant with the ISO 9000 standard, right? It actually includes, different areas, but it's actually not limited to this list. But here are some of the general concepts and topics that actually includes, right? So that actually has a base product security requirement, what they call a PSB, right? Also, third-party software security, right? How you handle open source and third-party software vulnerabilities. Secure design guidelines, guidelines around secure coding, secure analysis, and also vulnerability testing. Now, the goal of the SDL is actually to provide tools and processes that are designed to accelerate the product development methodology by developing secure, resilient, and trustworthy systems, right? Now, third-party software and open source security is one of the most important tasks for any organizations, right? Most of today's organizations actually use open source and third-party software libraries, right? And now this creates two requirements on the product security team. The first one is actually to know what third-party software libraries are used and reused within your company and where, right? And the second one is, of course, to patch any vulnerabilities that affect such library or the third-party software component. So, for example, if there's any vulnerability in OpenSSL or NTP, and it's actually disclosed today, what do you actually have to do, right? Can you quickly assess the impact of those vulnerabilities in your products? Also, if you use commercial third-party software, is the vendor of such software, transparently disclosing all the security vulnerabilities? Are they actually even going to ask you for money, if they need to actually fix a vulnerability, right? Nowadays, many organizations are including security vulnerability disclosure SLAs in their contract with third-party vendors, right? This is very important as many third-party software vulnerabilities, both in the commercial space and also open source software, go unpatched for many, many months or even years, right? Now, third-party software security is a monumental task for any company of any size, right? To get a feeling of the scale of third-party software, code usage, visit web pages either of organizations that are making these libraries or third-party security bulletins published by Cisco at the link that I'm actually sharing in here. Now, another good resource is cvedetails.com, right? They actually have tons of statistics and data around vulnerabilities and specific vendors, right? Now, there are many tools available in the market today to enumerate all open source components used in a product. Now, these tools either interrogate the product source code or scan binaries for the presence of third-party software, right? Here are a few examples, but of course there's many others. There are many others out there. The first one is actually Black Duck. There's also AppCheck from Cornomicon, Palamita, Lexomo, SourceClear, and again, the list goes on and on.